Visually striking and thought-provoking, Yes by British filmmaker Sally Potter certainly delivers in the experimental and unconventional filmmaking techniques expected of the director, exploring themes of love, self-discovery, identity and cultural identity through its unique subversion of classic Hollywood filmmaking. The film is spoken in poetic dialogue throughout and follows a unique narrative structure, although it can be applied to Freytag's 5-act. The exposition of the film introduces the audience to she, played by Joan Allen, a wealthy American in an unhappy marriage. In attending a banquet, she meets he, played by Simon Abkarian, a Lebanese chef. The rising action begins when the two start their passionate affair, which gets complicated through their cultural and religious differences. The climax sees both she and he battle with their own internal conflicts, ultimately breaking off their affair. Falling action is found when she travels to Cuba alone in honour of her aunt, played by Sheila Hancock, while he returns to Beirut. In the final act, he arrives in Cuba. The film ends ambiguously with the two reunited, yet no confirmation of their relationship. To Hayward, counter-cinema is, at its most simple, a cinema that, through its own cinematic practices, questions and subverts existing codes and conventions. But why subvert what works? To Karl Marx, the totality of the relations of production constitutes the economic structure of society. It is upon this foundation or infrastructure that a legal and political superstructure is then formed. Then, under capitalism, ownership of the means of production also gives control over the intellectual ideas and ideologies spread in the superstructure. To Freeden, ideologies map the political and social worlds for us. We simply cannot do without them because we cannot act without making sense of the worlds we inhabit. It is through the circulation of dominant ideologies, portraying an ideal expression of the dominant material relationships, that the ruling classes retain their control. But how do these ideologies remain dominant? Well, to Marxist Antonio Gramsci, ideology uses culture to influence those within the superstructure. Hegemony is a crucial concept to the Gramsci analysis of power relations, referring to the exercise of indirect power as exemplified in civil institutions. The institutions in question include forms of entertainment. Why does this matter? Baudry wrote of Apparatus theory in 1970. He speaks of the objective reality that sits in front of the camera. The camera behaves as an intermediary and transforms the objective reality, but does not allow the viewer to see the transformation. To Baudry, concealment of the technological base will also bring about a specific ideological effect. Classic Hollywood filmmaking has mastered the art of concealment. The more seamless the film, the more enraptured the audience in the text, the easier the pervasion of ideology. This system is to suture, at its simplest, to stitch the spectator into the filmic text. Hollywood films use techniques that are designed to discourage scrutiny and analysis so as not to ruin the immersion and therefore pervasion of ideology. Wollen identified the 7 values of old cinema, of which he listed narrative transitivity, identification, transparency, single diegesis, closure, pleasure, and fiction. In looking to Godard's take on counter-cinema, he then identified 7 contrasting values. He called these the 7 deadly sins of the cinema, listing narrative intransitivity, estrangement, foregrounding, multiple diegesis, aperture, unpleasure, and reality. Wollen identifies narrative transitivity as a sequence of events in which each unit follows the one preceding it according to a chain of causation, typically following a Todorovian structure with establishment of equilibrium, disruption, and then a restoration. Narrative intransitivity is then gaps and interruptions. The narrative in Yes unfolds in a non-chronological order, employing flashbacks. In she and he's first meeting, only the first couple lines of conversation are seen before the story moves on. By utilising non-linear narrative, the audience doesn't fully understand she's behaviour at the dinner. Immediately the audience are spectators in the two's relationship. They are not privy to all interactions. The audience are told they'll have to start paying attention. Identification occurs when the audience feels empathy for or emotional investment with a character. One of the many methods of estrangement is characters addressing the audience directly. The breakdown of identification is closely intertwined with narrative intransitivity, as a breakdown of solid relatable character breaks down audience emotional involvement in the story of the film. The cleaning staff break the fourth wall and address the camera. They serve as a Greek chorus, providing the audience with context about she and her husband. The cleaner refers to herself as invisible to the couple, beneath them. So then when the cleaners address the audience are brought to their level. Instead of being allowed to empathise with the main characters, the audience is immediately separated from them, placed beneath them. The immersion is regularly destroyed and the audience are forced to look at the text from a different perspective. Transparency wants the viewer to overlook the techniques and tools that made the film. Foregrounding, however, is making the mechanics of the film text visible and explicit. By writing the dialogue of the film entirely in prose, Potter is exposing the filmmaking technique of language. The writing style in the film is not meant to be easy to digest. The rhythm and cadence in which the couple speak are unnatural to the ear, so the viewer has to listen carefully and consider the words. In exposing the tools that construct the film, Potter is drawing the audience's attention to the dialogue and themes present in the piece. Multiple diegesis in this context is a rupture between different codes and different channels. It can often be represented in a rupture between soundtrack and images. A particular scene where there is a rupture between the soundtrack and image is when she visits her aunt in the hospital. The film blurs the boundaries between what is reality and what is being heard. Before she walks into the ward, we hear the monologue of her aunt begin. Since she cannot be seen, it's assumed that the conversation has already occurred and this is a flashback, or even that she might be actively speaking. However, when she turns the corner, we see the aunt is asleep. Whether the aunt is addressing the audience, monologuing in her own head, or if she and her aunt have already had this conversation is wholly unclear. It could also be inferred that she is imagining this monologue. Ultimately, the answer is not disclosed. The misalignment results in confusion, and the resulting narrative implications are up to audience interpretation. Closure to Wollen is a self-contained object, harmonised within its own bounds. Aperture, however, sees open-endedness, overspill, intertextuality, allusion, quotation, and parody. The all-round ambiguity of the text results in multiple interpretations of it, and as a result, no definitive ending. She prays to God after dedicating her life to science, and so appears he. There is a calming atmosphere between the two, displayed mainly through the mise-en-scène, with the calming pale blue paint on the walls, her mint green dress, and his khaki trousers. And as they spend a wordless moment together, the beach scene begins. They seem happy, but whether this truly happens or not is unconfirmed. The mise-en-scène points to this being a dream, with the two of them dressed entirely in white. When the two kiss, the frame rate drops, and the footage stutters and drags, a common motif in the film, adding to the dreamlike feel. To wrap up the film, the fourth wall is rebroken with a cryptic speech from the cleaner. The lack of conclusion forces the viewer to reflect upon the film's themes in order to decipher their own meaning, not to simply accept the filmmakers. Unpleasure serves to dissatisfy and hence change the spectator. By subverting conventions, the film removes the viewer's comfortability and replaces it with discomfort. It typically evokes strong emotional responses, serving as a catalyst for critical reflection. Unpleasure is shown in Yes in the ways it defies the conventions of the romance genre. The moral fantasy of the romance is that of love triumphant and permanent, overcoming all obstacles and difficulties. Yes denies the viewers this fantasy through its angsty plotline that shows love often cannot withstand every struggle. Love not only doesn't prevail in the affair, it also doesn't prevail in marriage. Ultimately, she and her husband could not resolve their differences and fell out of love. Her attempt to find love again after her husband's infidelity was also widely unsuccessful. The departure from the classic romance genre conventions denies the audience pleasure from the film. Fiction is equal to mystification, which is then equal to bourgeois ideology. Reality, however, is where the film convincingly depicts aspects of reality, achieved through realistic settings and costuming. The film blurs the line between reality and fiction. Written and filmed around the time of the Iraq War, the film uses real cultural conflicts circulating in British society at the time as a catalyst for his decision to return home, and as a breaking point in the two's relationship. From the racism-fueled argument in the kitchen to his struggle with his own religion, his traditional values driving a wedge between the two. Ultimately, real war and conflict is what drove them apart. She fails to recognise her privilege while he sees her as an oppressor. Yes makes use of real-world conflicts and debates in order to draw attention to the themes the film is trying to address and tackle. Potter's take on counter-cinema is overall highly effective in its use of Wollen's 7 deadly sins, successfully subverting traditional Hollywood norms and codes in order to force the viewer to think critically about the text. The text places the viewer outside of itself, providing the viewer with the tools to critique and discuss the ideologies and themes on display.